Hey, everybody. Welcome to Budgeting for Security and Local Government with Mike Hamilton, John Traeger. My name's Jake Milstein. I run all of the events for CI, and I run marketing at CI. Before we get started, people get in the room, a couple of big things are going on today. Three big things. Number one is, obviously the pipeline attack. Looks like they paid a $5 million ransom. Mike and I talked about that earlier on LinkedIn. And that other big thing is Mike read through all 3,000 pages, 4,000 pages
not long
of the presidential executive order on cybersecurity. And I'll post a link to the video on that if folks are curious about the big takeaways there. And then the third thing, and I just saw this, is now that 12 to 15-year-olds can get vaccinated. There are all these parents posting their kids holding up their vaccine cards. For the love of God, please do not tell everybody, don't post your vaccine cards online. Very bad.
Well, tell them why.
Well, because you don't want to put your birthday up there, and people are stealing them. And by the way, if you're
disclose information that can be used against you, and in some kind of fraud.
Well, especially, and if it's your kid, and your kid's identity gets, if you have a 12-year-old, your 12-year-old's identity gets stolen, you might not even know about it. Mm-hmm. You might not know about it for 4 years too. So till they get a driver's license or a credit card or something. Anyway, that's our rant for the beginning of all this. How's that? I think every webinar starts with a rant here at CI. All right. Looks like folks are getting in the room here, so let's get started. We're not going to talk about any of that. We're going to talk about budgeting for security and local government. Mike, next slide. Stick around until the end. A couple of reasons to stick around. Number one, the at the very end, we'll give you a survey. Curious to get your opinion on this, and there's a little poll in there. We're trying to get some data that we'll then share back out with you about budgeting and how it's going in municipalities around the country. And I see we actually have municipalities from around the country and from around the world here. So we'll get some good data there, and we'll share that back out. Second is you can get if you're in a place where you can get a gift card, we'll send you a gift card for filling it out. If you're not, you can donate your gift card to a food bank. So if you have the kind of rules where you can't get a gift card, or you just like giving to food banks, that you get good karma for that. And so the structure of today is that Mike Hamilton is going to talk about budgeting processes and how to squeeze more out of your budget. And then we'll go to a panel discussion with Mike and John. Mike is the former CISO of Seattle and founder of CI here. And John is CIO at City of Issaquah. And for those of you not in Washington, that is just east of Seattle and is a beautiful place in the foothills of the Cascades. And we'll talk about John in a little bit when we get to him, because John was also a former elected leader, which makes him really an interesting person to have on the panel. And with that, Mike, take it over.
All right. So what I am going to do is I'm just going to run through a little exercise here. It's not really an exercise. It's kind of a demonstration of something that I have done for a number of our customers. It doesn't really require a third party to do it, but the output, the outcome is such that it lends itself very well to being a budgeting tool. And as a bonus, you have your annual risk assessment done when you complete this. And so let's talk about that. So always good to ground yourself against some standard of practice. And which one doesn't even make that much difference? The NIST Cybersecurity Framework is good. I'll dive into that in just a second here. There's 20 critical controls. There are a variety of these standards of practice. Some are regulatory. They all look the same. The PCI standard, HIPAA, if you're in local government, you probably process credit cards and you're under the PCI data security standard. You handle health records. And so the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, definitely criminal justice data, CJIS. they all say essentially the same thing. They're all broken up into the same reasonable sections. It's governance, policy, access control. So, which one of these you pick is up to you. I'm going to take you through the NIST CSF here, and we're not going to do a deep dive, but I'll show you how this process works. So again, structuring this and have something that you can map back to that is an approved standard is a whole lot better than, just kind of willy-nilly, let's have a look around, let's see if we need to buy more antivirus. It is better if a third party does it, because especially in the public sector, and I'm sure John will agree with this when we talk, it carries a lot more weight for somebody outside the organization to say, here's what we say, needs to be fixed. Here are our recommendations. And, even in my experience in the city of Seattle, it was always instructive and useful to have a third party say the same thing that I've been saying, because it's going to be taken more seriously. And one of those reasons is it's the value of the record. When there's a record of a third party that says, we recommend that you really address these things, and nothing happens, that record will be used as a stick later to beat the IT management or the CIO or even elected officials. So it's also a great use of signing authority if you do want to bring a third party in, because this is not a difficult assessment to do, at least the way I'm going to show you. So if you have a $10,000 signing authority, you can probably get this done. To some degree. So let's start with an assessment. And the one that we like to use is the NIST Cybersecurity Framework, which is busted up into these 5 buckets. And I'm sure that everybody that's watching right now is familiar with this. The value of the NIST Cybersecurity Framework is, yes, it's an accepted standard of practice that was created by the federal government and given to anybody to use, any size organization in any sector. And the real beauty of it is that it is outcome-based and not prescriptive with respect to controls. So it will say, it won't say, you must manage your third-party access by imposing strict access control and adjudicating when they need access, when they don't, and logging all that and monitoring. That would be prescriptive. What it says is remote access by third parties is managed. That's it. How you do that is up to you. So an outcome-based framework, rather than something that's overly prescriptive and say, put this control in, put this control in, is much better for a one-size-fits-all type of method. So we're going to use the NIST framework for this. And we have put together a sheet that is essentially the NIST framework. And as you can see there, it's got category outcome. Notice that there are columns there for likelihood and impact. And so this is a little bit of a modification, because the NIST cybersecurity framework is really geared to aligning yourself with the standard of practice, but not necessarily measuring or estimating risk. So you can have a failure to meet one of the control objectives or those outcomes. What you don't know about that is, what's the likelihood of some bad event happening because of the failure to meet that outcome? And then if that bad thing happened, what would the impact to our organization be? So there's 2 columns there. And when for example, asset management, physical devices and systems within the organization are inventoried. Okay, well, this is actually my risk assessment for our company. And so several lists are extant, and they need to be consolidated and made comprehensive. Okay, that's one of our warts. Now, in the likelihood column, think about the actual events that you want to avoid. You don't want unauthorized disclosure of protected records, right? Records breach. Every state's got their statute that says you got to fall on your sword, publicly monitor everybody's credit, right? That's one bad outcome. Number 2, theft, extortion, right? Business email compromise is pretty much straight up theft. Extortion, ransomware. And then the third thing is just disruption for the sake of disruption, whether that's done by, an activist, And I can tell you, being the CISO for the city of Seattle, the activists were definitely there. Every time there was some event and there was lots of people that took issue with it, and so we would get denial of service and website defacements and things like that. Well, so just disruption for the sake of disruption. So there's three things: unauthorized disclosure of records, theft and extortion, service disruption. Those are the outcomes you want to avoid. And all of this cyber nonsense, it's talking about those outcomes. Everything that leads up to that, yes, is very technical and there's a lot to know about it, et cetera, but focus on those outcomes. So when we look at the columns there for likelihood and impact, so we don't have a really good list of everything on the network. As an artifact of not having that good inventory, not really knowing what's on the network, what is the likelihood we could have records disclosure, theft or extortion, or service disruption? Well, it's probably kind of low, right? What would the impact be if any of those things happened? Well, the impact would probably be pretty high. We would be unable to operate, for example. So what's low times high? Low times high is medium. There, you just did a risk calculation. It's that easy. Now, there are much more complex ways to do this. I've seen papers talking about risk management using differential equations. Nonsense. High, medium, low is good enough for most organizations, especially mid-market and local government. This is really made for you. Okay, so what we've done is we have found a place where we have a failure to adequately meet the outcome, right? The control objective. We have estimated the likelihood of some bad thing happening because of that failure and what the impact might be from that. Multiply those together, that gives us our risk. It's medium risk. Now, when you have a risk you've identified, there's only 4 things you can do about it. You can accept the risk, right? The 71 Pinto method of risk management. They knew they blew up and they said, it's cheaper for us to pay off the dead people's families than it is to fix all the cars. So we accept that risk. And that's a perfectly valid way to do it. You can avoid the risk, which means remove the condition that caused the risk in the first place. That Windows 2008 server, let's upgrade that. Or just turn it off. You can mitigate risk through the application of controls, which is kind of our swim lane here, or you can transfer risk through insurance. Those are the only things you can do with it. That's it. So we've defined a risk, we've identified it, we said it's a medium risk, and we say we're going to mitigate that. We're going to apply controls. And what is our recommendation on what to do? Perform a technical asset discovery and resolve/consolidate results with other lists. Okay, that sounds like that'll close that gap, right? Okay, so we have a couple of columns there for risk and cost. So we're just using integer math here. If it's a medium risk, it's a 2. If it's a high risk, it's a 3. If it's a low risk, it's a 1. Okay, and then cost. So cost can be 1, 2, or 3 as well. In our kind of shorthand way of doing this, if it's a 1, and you can read up the instructions how this is done. If it's a 1, then we're gonna handle that with internal resources. If it's a 2, we might need to bring in some professional services, some consulting. If it's a 3, it could include either or both of the previous 2 and potentially a capital purchase. So that's just the shorthand way of doing this. So now what we've done is we've identified risk, decided what the disposition of that risk is going to be, and then figured out not so much what the cost is, we'll get to that in a second, but how we're going to address that. Not only the thing we're going to do, but who's going to do it. So that's kind of step 1 right there. Complete this assessment and figure out who's going to do what and what they're going to do. And, this goes on and on and on and on. The spreadsheet is many pages long. Still, this is something you can do as a self-assessment in short order. I doubt if it would take any more than a couple of days to do this. Okay. So then We're going to take all those results. And so some of those are high risk, some are medium, some are low, and let's sort them. And let's make the high, and this is extremely abbreviated because I'm not going to show you all the warts in the company that we're working on fixing, but so we're going to sort those, and we're going to say these high risk things, we're going to address these in 6 months. Medium, we'll do it between 6 months and a year. And then everything else, the round off error, we're going to get to that over the next 2 years. Okay. What we have now is a corrective action plan. This is our big steaming pile of stuff we have to fix. So you will see now we're starting to figure out, well, if an internal resource is going to do this, how many hours will that take? And if we are going to if we require a capital purchase, what's that typically going to cost? If we need professional services to come in, we can get the consulting firm to estimate that, or we can estimate that fairly well. And now we're starting to look at a 2-year corrective action plan that is split into 3 parts. So it's 0 to 6 months, 6 months to a year, and then 1 year to 2 years. We understand how many internal resource hours are going to be applied. We see what we're going to spend on professional services, and we've estimated capital costs for gizmos we may need to buy. And again, you can do all this in a couple of days. Now, this handles the corrective action plan, the big steaming pile. You got to manage all of this. Somebody is going to have to make sure that there is some kind of rhythm, some kind of ritual we go through on some routine basis to look at our list of stuff and say, okay, what's the next thing we're going to tackle here? And do we need to pass this off to the IT group or to finance or to HR or to whoever to do this? And so that kind of coordination, well, that's the management part of this. And so if we look, and again, all of the regulatory requirements and standards of practice all say basically the same thing, okay? The PCI data security standard, think of it as a taco. HIPAA, think of it as a burrito. Criminal Justice Information Services, think of that as a tostada. The ingredients are all the same. The packaging is a little different. And so every one of those says that you need to do these things on an annual basis or a quarterly basis or a monthly basis. And so that's a reasonable matrix right there of the job of the information security officer or the person who is accountable for making sure the security things get done. Okay, so weekly, there's going to have to be things like, meetings. There's going to be stuff that pops up, ad hoc, interrupt-driven stuff, the incident management. If you have consultants in, you're going to have to manage the consultants. Definitely planning. Monthly, you should be doing a rule review of your firewalls and other network-based access control devices. Making sure that you're assembling and archiving the artifacts you will need in the event that you are ever audited or required to show how you've been handling security. And again, there's the corrective action InfoSec ritual there. Well, that's got to be done all the time. And then quarterly, really, it is a good idea to go through all of the access authorization levels that everybody has, make sure if somebody's changed roles, they didn't carry access to something with them that they didn't need. That's a requirement. Making sure that you have some kind of governance meeting so that if there is a risk that you decide to accept, you get somebody's fingerprints on that and say, yes, the organization has agreed, we're going to accept that risk. Or no, we don't agree, and we've decided we're going to resource that. So that governance is very important. And then notably, every quarter, you're going to have to do a couple of the annual requirements to keep on track. Well, what are the annual requirements? You got to do a pen test every year. You got to do security awareness training every year. You should do an annual risk assessment. You should do a policy review. You should do a tabletop exercise, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, this matrix right here, this is your recipe for being the information security officer right there. So all of these are going to cost something as well. So there's a table there on the left where we've kind of estimated the hours that are going to go into these things and where we're going to have to bring in professional services. Don't do your own penetration testing. It won't count. So from this, apart from the corrective actions and what it's going to cost in order to mitigate those risks, bring those risks down, here we know what it's going to cost to do all the management around that. So now, what have we done? We have provided a biennial budget request, a 2-year budget request that is aligned with the things that we need to do in security. We have a management and governance structure so that we can escalate things appropriately up to executive management, in fact, to elected officials, to adjudicate what we're going to do about certain risks that we've identified. Right? We don't want to make these decisions ourselves. This is done through governance. You just finished your annual risk assessment. You have it. Importantly, you have controls that will survive scrutiny. And here's why that's important. One of our jobs in the public sector in IT and security is to insulate the organization from accusations of negligence, for example. So stuff is going to happen. You will never reduce the likelihood of bad things happening to zero. It's too easy for us to go throw USB sticks in your parking lot and wait until a good Samaritan says, I want to see what's on there. It's that easy. So stuff is going to happen. It doesn't mean that you're going to get crushed in the media if something happens, because you will be able to say, we've done our risk assessment. We understand what our corrective actions are. We have budgeted for these things. We have a plan. We have a ritual that we go through where we address these things. We're doing everything right? We have done everything we could to reduce the likelihood of bad outcomes, to make sure that we're managing the impacts of the ones that occur. We know what our roadmap looks like. It's all been agreed to. We have governance structure, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That is defensible. No one will ever say you're not doing it right. So this is an incredibly easy exercise to go through, and we'll provide you the spreadsheet if you want, and I'm even willing to give you a little primer on it if you want to talk on the phone or something. So this is not a heavy lift, and this is, and I've actually performed this for some of our government customers. And this starts to line things up so that everybody starts to feel, we've kind of got our arms around this now. We understand what our battle rhythm needs to look like. We understand the boxes we got to tick off every year and how we prepare for actual audits. The FBI shows up, or State Patrol shows up to do your CISO audit. The police department's got to have a lot of stuff in order here. Well, this might be, part of your PCI audit materials or something like that. So I think one of the greatest values of this is your ability to demonstrate that you're doing things correctly and insulate the organization from claims of negligence. Nobody wants to be above the fold. Okay, and with that, that's the whole presentation. Let's start talking.
So, and I'll also tell folks over in the chat, if you have questions, go ahead and put them in there. And Mike does have a budgeting spreadsheet that he showed there. If you want a copy of it, just shoot me an email and I'll get it back to you. My email address is jake@ci.security. So I want to bring John in here. So John, as I said before, you have an unusual past in that you got elected, then you stopped being elected. Now you're the CIO of the city. So let's talk about the electeds here. When Mike just unveiled this plan, how do you get the electeds on board with what you need?
That's a really good question. I think current events helps, kind of keeping that visible. I'm sure everybody else shares this, a little difficult during COVID times. You don't get the hallway conversation or the after discussion after a council meeting or any of that. You don't get that kind of exposure. But that's how I did it. Was you have to work the crowd. One of the challenges is talking to the council about it without shouting out to the public that we're in deep trouble and we have a big pile of due to work on. Because you don't really want, or announce that we're good and we think we're Fort Knox. Either way is not a good idea to do that publicly. So you have to come up with a way to communicate sort of side channels. And you can do things publicly, just talking about current events that don't involve your organization itself, to raise awareness. And that's always good for the public to come along. Most organizations have the usual suspects of the members of the public who doubt anything that's ever brought up that costs any money at all. So it's good to have that drumbeat about what's happening out there in the world in terms of risk, without being specific to your own risk in a public manner.
Yeah, I mean, I know I was talking to one of our public sector customers, and they were saying that the budget opened up a bit when a hospital nearby got hit with malware. I don't remember if it was ransomware or a different kind of malware, but even though it wasn't a public sector thing, it made everybody think about it. So that makes a ton of sense. So, John, when you're on the council versus now being in the seat you're in now. How did you weigh the IT and security spend then versus how you weigh it now?
So this was back in 2007 through 11. So security spend was not the consideration. Really, the issue was blocking and tackling. That, they had a lot of legacy IT that was way behind. And I was the friendly voice of the council for the IT manager at the time, who was trying to get money for new servers. And it was interesting trying to illustrate. Then it was all about efficiency and, uptime. If you don't keep up and stay current and maintain your underlying systems, you're going to end up with downtime and loss of productivity. So security wasn't a big point, but now it's both, because now you're going to have downtime and public exposure and additional costs. Especially if you lose public data, PII, it gets published by a ransomware attack.
On the upside, though, local governments are monopolies, and so it's not like people can say, "But you know what? I'm going to have the city over there start taking my garbage away," or something like that. And so nobody's ever going to fall over and go out of business. But I think that so I'm not a real fan of fear, uncertainty, and doubt, as a way to, incent change. But definitely when something happens to either somebody in your geography or another organization that looks just like you, it's important to bring that to the attention of the people who actually sign off on things like budget, and just say, just want you to know this stuff is going on out in the world, and the volume has gone way up, because it has gone way up, and local governments especially have been just harangued by this ransomware junk and just extorted all over the place. And so I'm sure that's on everybody's radar already. You don't even need to say it.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that somebody asked us for a while ago, and I forgot to have it ready for this, is an executive briefing on ransomware, where and we wrote it, and I'm happy to send it around to folks. But it's just an explainer that anybody can read about ransomware, that you can edit and say, this is what we're doing. But those are helpful, right?
Yeah, that's part of that sort of drumbeat of communication about general risk that's happening in the local government sector. So not just, it could be your hospital, it's like your actual local government, and the data we have about water customers could be gone if you're not protecting it correctly.
And so
that gets their attention. So
yeah, and Michael in the chat here says be proactive about your own efforts to mitigate risks and why they're critical. Use a current event like the pipeline hack as a talk point reference. So question about that. So we've one of the other fellows we work with said, don't let a news event go to waste. What which ones matter more? Are they local events that happen? So if something happens to another city, or like I was mentioning before, a local hospital, or something of international or national import, like the pipeline one.
Oh yeah, local events. I mean, that's a attention getter. We had a near miss. A city just to the north of us got completely wiped out. And partly because they didn't do the blocking and tackling. All their systems were way outdated. So they were barely keeping uptime, much less worrying about cybersecurity. So they were easily tipped over, and they had to rebuild everything. They were writing checks by hand for months
Oh,
to make payroll and all
Wow.
kinds of other disasters associated with that. So that certainly bolstered any cybersecurity investments that I wanted to make with the executive team. Because the thing about, as most people probably know, you start with the executive team because they're the ones who ultimately pitch a budget to the council. And you could use side channels, but you can't really bring dollar amounts directly to the council unless the executive team wants you to.
So, I hate to keep talking about the pipeline thing because nobody here runs Colonial Pipeline, or I guess I could look at the audience. Maybe I hear they're looking for a new security manager.
They are.
They are. No, I mean, that job is actually posted. That wasn't just Equip, although it was also that. But if you can go get $5 million from Colonial Pipeline, why bother targeting local government, Mike? Why are criminals coming after municipalities?
Because the ability of local government, so the things that local government does are so critical that the impact of disruption could actually be loss of life. Okay, when you're talking about the radio systems that allow the cops to communicate to make sure that they get to your house before the home invasion robbery turns ugly, or whatever. The actual impact there could be loss of life. And so when you have something that's either that critical where the potential impact is so high, or if you have an organization that knows on a per minute basis how much money they're going to lose if they get snarled, those are the ones that they target to go after, because you're much more likely to pay that ransom to be able to get back to work quickly. Disrupting what we saw is an energy pipeline, so this is the oil and gas sector, which is kind of adjacent to the energy sector. It's the pipeline itself is part of the transportation sector, and I'm not making this up. The DHS agency that handles cybersecurity over pipelines is the Transportation Security Administration. It's the TSA.
What?
So,
yeah,
if you want your gas to keep flowing, take off your shoes. So, that's there's kind of this mishmash of things there, but
there's one other thing that
they knew how much money they were going to lose, and that's why they had to get back to work. Right? It's the criticality of that stuff. So it's being picked out of the herd.
But also, like you think about mid-sized to small municipal government. There's something that lawyers have always realized, that they may not have a lot of money, but they have the power of taxing.
Mm-hmm.
So you get treated as though you're a megacorp, even though you're nothing. You're smaller than a medium-sized regional business. But they know that you could always tax people to raise the money to cover the disaster.
As like you get hit by ransomware, and so you bring up a ransomware levy to pay the ransom.
No, well, let's say you lost the entire servers and everything. There's no recovery. You're going to have to pay for it.
Time for a bond.
Right. So, because there's that risk, then they know that you're going to have insurance because risk isn't just ransomware per se itself. It's like, what if they attack the water system and they did something on the major reservoirs? In our case, there's a lot of gravity fed stuff. You could create a very, very expensive disaster, millions of costs. In fact, we just went through the IWA or whatever it is.
Yeah,
audit.
Water Infrastructure Act.
And we did okay, but the whole discussion, we realized how much risk is actually there if you don't get it right in that space.
Well, Mike, you were going to say something.
I wanted to start bringing us back to money, not just money that you lose when stuff goes bad, but how you get money to secure your organization, especially the high risk things like water purification, waste treatment, all those. Because I read yesterday that there's a new bill that has been brought up in the House of Representatives. Derek Kilmer, who's my congressman, is one of the co-signers, and this is creating a $500 million grant program. And my read of this was for local government, not state and local government, local government. So, there's nuance around Yes, the application process is probably pretty straightforward, but there's nuance around what you can do and what you cannot do with grant money. So in my experience, you can't use grant money to, for example, encumber a multi-year contract. It's really good for capital purchases, but there's only so many gizmos you can buy. Do you have some insight into how grant funding may be applied? And I think a whole lot of this is for cybersecurity, so they may be relaxing some of these restrictions. But we always had to, and I guess I'm making an admission here, statute of limitations is over. We always had to kind of dance around some of these issues and call certain things consulting, because you can always, consulting is fair game, right?
You can capitalize that, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. It really depends. It kind of almost like the NIST thing. Is this going to be outcomes-based grants, or are they going to be prescriptive grants? Because of the prescriptive, it gets really hard to, fit all the different sizes of cities and problem sets that are out there. It's kind of bottomless. If it's outcome-based, then you could possibly spend money on legacy apps that have to go because they're really your major exposure. It's not exactly technically a cybersecurity purchase, but it's absolutely solving one of your major NIST risk factors, is that you have no good access control on this legacy system, and it's kind of running with scissors all the time. You've got to do something about it.
Yeah.
And nobody wants to run with scissors. But talking about funding and the like, if that comes to pass, is that federal money that then goes to cities, or does it go to states and then the states figure out how to distribute it? How would that work, Mike?
So it depends on the grant program. So, and so this is one of the limitations of one of the existing grant programs, right? It's called UASI, the Urban Areas Security Initiative. And the way that works is, the state is able to adjudicate, and it's all done by committee, and emergency management people, law enforcement, public safety. There's a lot of people at the table, and they say, well, what are the riskiest things in the state that we can spend this, kind of limited pot of money on? And so what they're going to do, it's the major metro areas are going to get all the money because they're the most risk, right? They have the greatest economic exposure. It's more likely that they have, things like chlorine plants, chemical processing plants, things like this. So what happens is that little town out there in Alabama, Eastern Washington, wherever, they're frozen out. But they still make your toilet flush. They still make your water drinkable. They still make the cops get to your house on time, and they run 911, right? So they are equally as critical. So my hope is, and I'm going to call Derek Kilmer about this. My hope is that this is not going to get funneled through a state. There's something called State Homeland Security Program. It works the same way. My hope is that this is not going to get funneled through the state, and they're going to do a hands-on approach to local governments and spread this around, because it doesn't matter how big you are, it matters how critical you are.
Yeah. And so in the chat, Michael says, if criminals are behind these attacks, is their prime objective to get large ransom payments or create devastation? And
it's all
probably depends on the criminals. Some just want to watch it burn. Others want the funds. Yeah, Mike, you say it's all about the money, but you also talked about activism earlier. So maybe it is and maybe it's not.
Well, maybe it is and maybe it's not. There's a fair amount of collusion between organized crime and, in Russia and the Russian government, right? So, which is which? Absolutely. So the objective of, the gang that just did the pipeline, dark side, this is a ransomware as a service gang. Who's the buyer? Who was the buyer that decided this is our target? All right. And, and believe me, in Russia, the GRU and the SRV know exactly what's going on with all of their criminal groups. Okay.
Yeah. So emerge. There's a wink, wink, nod, nod from Putin about all these, criminal gangs. If they make some money, that's good, but they also disrupt these countries, and they surprisingly don't attack Russia. So, there's other stuff, when you talk about cities and water departments, there's other countries very interested in at least having hooks that they could pull triggers on.
Mm-hmm.
And that's one of the major risks that keeps me up at night, is some coordinated attack across the Western US or something.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're answering Vern's question here. It says, what are the ties to government other than plausible deniability?
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
plausible deniability is a big one.
Yeah.
What are the ties to government? And so I read tons of news, and there's lots of reporting on how the criminal groups in Eastern Europe and specifically Russia actually trade tools with the intelligence communities. Mm-hmm. So, there's more of a nexus there than just, hey, we look the other way while they operate out of the country. This is bringing a lot of money out of the United States and into other countries. And especially if you've been sanctioned almost out of existence, this probably is, a non-insignificant term in your GDP. So, they have an economic reason to not only look the other way, but probably help support it.
Yeah.
So kind of getting it back to local, one of the things I was thinking about is you're competing with all the other stuff people want to do. Mm-hmm. So they want to build a new park. They want to do whatever. And trying to position, spending on technology of any kind, especially cybersecurity, with those is very difficult. That's where back channels are really important for decision makers, because you can't get out there and show a beautiful park publicly and say you could spend all this money on this cool thing. You can't do the same thing with security and go, we're about ready to die here if we don't do something really quick, and we need a lot of money. It's an interesting phenomenon, but I try to position it like, we're doing this so you can have your park. You're doing this so you can have your state-of-the-art police dispatch system. All these cool things. This is the underpinning you have to have. It's just like the basic network infrastructure. This is another piece of that. You can't operate without it.
I mean, like a former Seattle mayor who famously gave a terrible Seattle snowstorm a B- or B+. I mean,
Greg.
can you say nobody gets elected on cybersecurity, but you sure can lose your mayor, your mayorship or your council position based on cybersecurity? Does that work?
Yeah, that's certainly what happened to the city to the north of us. There was a lot of changes of faces at the next election. And I don't know if it was all directly related or if probably the whole, government isn't functioning thing came up. So,
and again, I'm going to go back to this. One of the main value propositions for going through this exercise, setting up your corrective action plan, having a risk assessment handy, understanding, what it's going to cost to get things done, and fighting for that budget, it insulates the employees, the executives in particular, and the electeds, from all of this nonsense going on. Even if you get whacked, you can say we were doing the right things, right? There's no way you can pick us out and say, we were falling down on this. So, that is, I think, an important part of the narrative when, and I don't know, how comfortable people are with saying that, in an open forum is going to be really tough. But saying, listen, you need to do this so that you don't get the axe, when something happens, because something will happen. And that's the thing I don't think we tell our elected officials and our, corporate leadership enough. Something is going to happen. And how we handle that means everything about what we look like on the other end of it. So if I'm an elected leader, I'm like, okay, then here's a chunk of money. Go and automate this. Go get, some AI and let it handle security. Right? That is an option. And with, to the federal government's credit, there are all these competing needs for all the, money in the public sector, right? You need that park, right? We need more cops, all this stuff. But when FedGov says this money can only be spent for this thing, then there is no argument about it. And so it's just creating, the application for that, and hopefully that spurs all of this on, so it becomes routine, because that money is not going to last forever. And if you want to sustain the programmatics, you're going to have to support it.
That's the question. If it's just one-time grant money, even if it's like a 2-year run or 3-year run, that's not going to cut. What do I do after that? So I've, got all kinds of tools. I need staff to actually make sense of it. Even if it's done with third party, you need staff to talk to the third party, then, make sure you're meeting your NIST, targets, and you're getting the outcomes you want. And it is another piece of work that's not in your typical or traditional IT staffing budget. It should be now, obviously, but are they going to support ongoing staffing costs? Because that's, when it comes to electeds, that is the hardest Rubicon to cross, is adding people. They just do not want to add people.
Yeah.
And they'll spend a lot on professional services, even ongoing, just to avoid adding people, because headcount is like this big target on their back.
So you could outsource it.
Yeah, absolutely. And
frankly, that's a pitfall in what you brought up, Jake. The whole automation thing, right? We'll just get all this stuff to make decisions for. So a couple of things. Number one, Gartner conference, the last one, in the before times when I was able to go, they polled all of their customers and said, would you allow a piece of technology to make a decision by itself without human oversight? And 100% of the customers said no. So what does that mean? Well, it means all of this automation stuff needs oversight, and it doesn't put itself to work. It's not easy to get all this stuff to work. So, if your intent through buying into automation was to reduce the number of headcount you have, you are likely to achieve an outcome that is exactly the opposite of the one you intended. So keep that in mind.
Yeah, and some great comments here in the chat. Michael saying cybersecurity.
I think Vern's was directed at me.
Michael saying cybersecurity budget funding is like life insurance. You hate the payments. When an event occurs, you count your blessings. Yeah, since I just took advantage of my car insurance, I understand that. And then Vern says, I like the healthcare analogy. You can smoke and eat McDonald's for a good part of your life, but eventually it's going to catch up to you. Same is true with security. Don't spend now. Don't build the program. It'll catch up with you, and most likely in the worst possible way. And then Michael says outsourcing is indeed a sellable option to leadership versus hiring additional staff. Yes, and by the way, CI is a great outsourcing solution if you're looking for one. Throwing that in as a quick moment. Brian asks a good question here. Is it still safe to use the 10% of your tech budget? Is 10% of your tech budget should be spent on cybersecurity rule, or has that changed? John?
Depends on how big your base budget is, because there's kind of a minimum dollar threshold period you have to hit just for, if you have servers and internet presence, then you have to hit that minimum. And then above that, it's probably a decent, heuristic, I'd guess. That would probably conclude outsourcing. If you're hiring a bunch of staff, they're really, really expensive for qualified staff. So that would be a different number.
Yeah. Mike, how would you answer that?
I would say that 5 to 7% is more the standard. And if you're doing 10%, you're doing great. You are doing really well. Even in corporate, in the private sector, I've never heard of anybody reaching 10%. I mean, that really would be great.
Yeah. Yeah. Hey, so one of the other things that came up, and a good question here is when you're looking for the right solution, some folks have gone RFP, other folks have taken a news event and skipped the RFP. How's procurement working these days? John?
That's a loaded question.
Purposely.
In government, it's unnecessarily complicated, but that's the way it runs. Buying through state contracts for small cities or any other city you have a interlocal agreement with saves a ton of time. Putting things out to bid if you're a small organization is really onerous. And in our case, we save it for only the really big stuff. Like, we're going to replace our finance system. Okay. that's going to have to be put out to bid. But larger cities, they have the staff, they have the resources. That's how they roll.
Yeah, I mean, from the perspective of the vendors, government procurement is awful. It is awful. And I don't see a reason for driving up your own costs to do that. If you just put it on a dang website, fill in the information you want, and we'll do it that way. This 25 pounds of paper, 5 copies, got to be delivered by 5 o'clock, got to, be signed in red ink, all this stuff. Come on. This is where some real reform is necessary. And by doing that, you would save lots of money.
It's an example of be careful what you ask for public, because the public is so worried about misspending or poor decision-making of their tax dollars that they are the ones who drive this intense oversight of every purchase and all these really onerous rules. And then the same public then turns around and complains, why is it so hard? And that's the part of the government that just is what it is that because of the risk averse nature, because everybody gets hoisted as soon as the one error is spotted, they tend to build into these arcane processes. And then, as you guys know, in the private sector, you make those same mistakes all the time, but you don't have to tell anybody. Maybe your shareholders if it's actually enough to hit your bottom line, but you just kind of suck it up and keep moving forward, right?
Well, all right, if I'm in your seat, John, how do but I need, I figured out, okay, I've done Mike's spreadsheet, I've done an assessment, and I need, I need more. How do I do it with, if I do an RFP, I'm going to have to, create the RFP. It's going to take me 6 to 8 months. How do I do it fast? Like, how do you skip it?
Like I said, the state contracts are good. You still should have your own, at least internal requirements, definition, and sort of a justification of why this category vendor or why, and then get pricing from 3 vendors that are from the state pricing, but the state pricing usually is scaled to the size of the organization, and put those numbers up. But your criteria helps you because if you have 3 vendors that fit generally, but one's way more expensive than the other 2, but that's really the right solution for whatever reason. You have to have justification, and that's where you're, a nice detailed requirement spreadsheet that was built beforehand and submitted to the vendors, and they had to answer the do they have it or don't they type of thing. Gives you a defensible choice without having to do an RFP is that, but on steroids with way more detail, way more time, and way more et cetera going on. But that's what we do generally. There's a certain dollar threshold where you don't have to do any of that. But once you get over a certain amount, you have to go and at least get 3 price quotes, or three quotes.
3,
yeah, and then pick one.
Mm-hmm. And there's, from my perspective, there's, these are the only ways to kind of reduce the procurement load. When you have your budget and you're ready to spend money on stuff, there's the interlocal agreement, right? And we know that if we win competitively with an RFP, that contract can be used with anybody that's in the same region under the same set of rules, right? So there's that. There's the sole source way of doing it. You have requirements that are so tight, only that vendor can meet our requirements, right? But then the state auditor comes looking around and says, you can't pull that trigger very often. No. And this happened recently, there's a relaxation of competitive procurement rules in emergency situations. And as far as I'm concerned, we're in it. We're there. And, this nonsense about we're going to take 6 months to buy a thing, somebody's got to rethink this.
Yeah, I mean, there's no way, right? With everything going on, you see, we talked about earlier, a city near you gets hit, you feel the need to do something. Hey, let's go ahead and, do an RFP, right? It's just too slow. Question here from Kave. If you're a small organization with a limited security budget, is vCISO a good option for getting advice on how to appropriately distribute that budget into security applications and infrastructure? Mike?
So I would say if and only if your virtual CISO knows something about the public sector, because man, it's different. I worked for 20, maybe 15 years as a consultant for Gardant and VeriSign, and when it was all the private sector. That's a whole lot different than when I got to local government and worked with the city of Seattle and partners in the region, and there's a whole different set of concerns there. So I would say if you want a virtual CISO, make sure it's somebody that actually knows something about your space.
Yeah, I mean, in the private sector, a 320 person organization that maybe does 100 million is not going to have 40 lines of business, which we do.
Right.
So it's like the complexity. I mean, the portfolio is crazy for such a small organization, and that's pretty typical if you have all the services.
Yeah,
we have everything but fire in our city, so it's pretty normal.
Cool. We're going to get to, it seems like really strong advice. When we're going to get to final thoughts here in a minute, I want to put in the chat the survey link. So please take the survey. We appreciate it. You can donate your gift card to charity, to a food bank, or we'll send you a gift card for taking the survey. But we really appreciate it. And there's some questions in there about security budgeting we'd love to answer. Also, as I mentioned before, email me if you want either that executive briefing or Mike's spreadsheet, Mike's budgeting spreadsheet.
The city of Seattle auditor.
Appreciate CI doing these webinars for local government. I'm worried or suspicious about Mr. Hamilton, given that he has an anarchist mask prominently displayed in his office. I worry about Mr. Hamilton all the time. I just want you to know that. I talk to him every day, and I always worry about him. So just so you know. So just quick note. Here are the things CI Security does. I said I wouldn't sell things, but I'm not. So hey, here's what we do. We do managed detection response. We do incident response. We do assessments. We do testing. We do compliance. Evan wants to know about the floppy behind me. For those of you who are in or around the Seattle area, that is actually the boot disk for Cairo 7. That obviously I don't use it anymore. All right. Here's the email address for me, email address for Mike. I didn't ask John if I could put his up, so I didn't put it up. All right, guys, final thoughts. John, you first.
So funding it is, a finesse case when you have elected officials. I think if you overplay the risk thing, you get turned deaf ears. So it's kind of capability and risk. It's both. You want to go do this thing, that's great. Here, you have to include coverage, cost, the risk. And it really starts with the executive team, which leads you to the electeds. You need a team sell the elected officials. It can't just come from the IT only to electeds, or it goes nowhere.
Mike, final thoughts.
So I would say get ready for not only budget season coming up, but also grant application season. Get your ducks in a row, and if you don't know what you're going to be asking for, because your arms aren't really around this security thing, we're happy to provide tools, advice, things like that, to help you organize this so that here's our 2-year roadmap. We know this is what we got to spend, and that's your justification, right? So take this time. We have time now. But use these tools and come up with a really good list of things that you're going to need to spend money on, and get ready to start making your pitch.
Great. Thanks, guys. And I also want to thank Ginny, who none of you get to see, but puts all of our events together. One of the things that Ginny is actually putting together is a list of upcoming events, because we've heard from people, hey, we want to know about the events. So we'll get that coming here in a little bit, but she does a great job. So thanks to her in the background. Also, thanks to John for joining us on this one. It's the first one John's joined, and I thought he did pretty well. We'll bring him back. Thanks, John. And Mike, as always, thank you. I appreciate the fact that people in the chat are concerned about you. We're all concerned about you. But we're glad to have you here. Everybody, thanks for joining. Again, shoot me an email if you want those documents. We'll send out the PowerPoint here as a PDF to everybody, and have an awesome day.
Okay, bye everybody.
Bye everybody.
Bye John. Bye Jake.